This webinar is going to be recorded, and just for those who just signed in, we're across 10 time zones today. So once again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Stephen Portnoy. I am the Executive Director of Men of Reform Judaism. MRJ is the place where we recognize our Jewish values and honor our heritage. I extend greetings from Rob Himmelstein, our president, who could not join us this afternoon. Before we begin, I want to introduce two gentlemen from our South Florida region who are instrumental in helping bring this webinar to fruition. Jeff Agron. Jeff is a member of Temple Beth Am in Miami, a leader of our South Florida region, and a member of MRJ's Executive Council. He has also served on the URJ's North American Board, the Alumni Committee of that board, and he is involved with the Religious Action Center, also known as the RAC. He is also chair of Beth Am's Youth Engagement and Religious School. Our moderator is Tad Schwab. Tad is passionate about Israel, and this passion began immediately following the Yom Kippur War when he went on a UJA college leadership mission. Following that mission, he has never wavered in his passion for Israel, visiting at least yearly. He works on projects with his federation, P2G, and is involved with both the IMPJ, the Israel Movement for Progressive Judaism, and IRAC, the Israel Religious Action Committee. Tad is a NAB alum, North American Board, and serves on the WUPJ Executive Board, and that is the World Union for Progressive Judaism. And now it is my honor and privilege to introduce MK Rabbi Gilad Kariv. His accomplishments are many, so as to have more time with him, I'm just going to present a few highlights. Rabbi Kariv serves as a minister of Knesset in the 24th Knesset. He is a member of the 36th Israel government and is chair of the Constitution, Law, and Justice Committee. Previously, he was the president and CEO of the IMPJ. Rabbi Kariv served in the IDF Special Talpiot Project of the Intelligence Corps. He graduated from the Faculty of Law at Hebrew University, earning a combined degree with a BA in Law and Jewish Philosophy. He studied in the Israel Rabbinical Program of HUC, Hebrew Union College, and was ordained in 2003. Rabbi Kariv led the negotiations on the Kotel issue, together with leaders of the conservative movement, and the negotiations led to a historic decision to create a pluralistic section of the wall, a decision later frozen and rescinded by the then government. I'm pretty sure we're going to hear a bit more about the Kotel. Rabbi Kariv resides in Ramat Gan with his wife Noah and their 3 children. Rabbi?
Shalom, חברים, בוקר טוב, צהריים טובים, and ערב טוב to you all. It's a real pleasure to be here with you in this webinar. Thank you. I want to thank the leadership of MRJ for inviting me to share with you my thoughts and to answer your questions. Shalom, dear Ted, a dear friend and a partner of our movement here in Israel, and I'm looking at the list of names and I can identify many other partners and friends, and shalom to you all. I want to start first by apologizing for not being able to attend the original date of our webinar. Unfortunately, I was caught by COVID-19 and suffered from an intensive situation. And as you can see, I'm now speaking from my office in the Knesset, in the Israeli parliament in Jerusalem, and I'm back to work, and everything is okay. But I can share with you on a personal base that this is definitely not only a flu. And I hope that our two societies and all the other nations around the world will find the sophisticated and balanced ways to preserve our life routine while we are fighting this pandemic. I understand that I'm invited to share with you a few general thoughts about the political situation in Israel, the new government and the new opportunities that we have as the Israeli reform movement, and then to open the floor for questions and answers. And allow me to share the following opening remarks. I'll start by saying that becoming a member of the Israeli parliament, a member of the Knesset, was always a dream of mine. In many interviews in the last 6 months, I said that many years before I understood that my call is to become a reform rabbi here in Israel, I dreamt about a political career, and it started in a very, very early age. And still, I would like to suggest that in so many ways, the future of reform, progressive, liberal, non-Orthodox Judaism in Israel will be set mainly by the deeds of my predecessors in the Israeli reform movement headquarters, and by the deeds of my many, many partners, colleagues, and friends that are still leading reform congregations in Israel, teaching bar and bat mitzvah classes, working every day to welcome new converts into our congregations, and presenting the values and the practices of egalitarian and inclusive Judaism to thousands of Israeli families. And I'm saying it not as a way to be modest, and not in order to suggest that having a reform rabbi in the Israeli parliament and having a reform rabbi at the head of the Knesset Constitutional Committee, which is one of the 3 most important parliamentarian committees in the Knesset, I'm not suggesting this is not a major breakthrough. And definitely there are many, many things that can be achieved by the fact that our movement has a direct representation in the Israeli parliament. But I still insist that in the end, in spite the fact that it is much easier today to reach the headlines of the Israeli media, in the end, the future of our movement in Israel and the pluralistic nature of the Israeli society and the future of the relations between the State of Israel and diaspora Jewry will be mainly set by our ability to set facts on the ground and to turn Reform Judaism and Progressive Judaism. And in that regard, I also refer to our brothers and sisters from the other non-Orthodox movements and streams. I really believe that in the end, our ability to present our Jewish ideas, our ability to make sure that Reform Judaism is found around the corner in the vast majority of Israeli cities, urban communities, and in the kibbutzim and the moshavim across the country. In the end, this will set the future of our movement in Israel. And when I served the Israeli movement as its president for almost 12 years, I said again and again that for many years we had the false assumption that first we change the relations between state and synagogue in Israel. And first we promote through legal means freedom of religion and religious tolerance and pluralism in Israel, and then we will be able to serve the Israeli audience. And for the last 12 years as the president of the Israeli movement, I kept saying, and Ted and many others in this webinar can testify that this was my pitch. I always said it's the other way around. First, we expose tens of thousands of Israelis to what we have to offer, and then we will be able to create this necessary legal, political, constitutional change that will then lead to more achievements and to a wider exposure in Israel. And if you look at my CV, you will see that I tried 4 different times to be elected to the Knesset, mostly through the Israeli Labor Party, that knew many challenging days and years in the last decade. And only 6 months ago, I was able to implement my personal and I think our communal desire. And in the end, when I look back, I'm not surprised by the fact that it took me almost 10 years. I think that only after we succeeded to expand the work of our movement in Israel, and only after through many civil battles and civil moves, we succeeded to expose a huge Israeli audience to our values and practices. We were also able to come and tell them this is the time also to create a constitutional, political, and legal change. And I'm saying it because, again, I'm not surprised at the fact that we have today a reform rabbi in the Israeli Knesset, 1 out of 120. I'm not surprised by the fact that it makes the headlines. And I'm not surprised that in the last 6 months, usually the Israeli media referred to me in order to say something about Reform Judaism. But please, please, please keep in mind that the real work or the hard work is being done in our 50 congregations around the country. And in the end, that we need to double this number in the next 10 to 15 years. And I hope that in your next Israeli webinar, you'll invite my predecessor, Anna Kislansky, the new executive director of the IMPJ, the Israel Movement for Reform and Progressive Judaism, the first woman to serve our movement as its leading professional. Now, after this long opening sentence, allow me to share my thoughts both on the general political situation in Israel and then to address some issues in regard to religion and state relations and the role that our movement can play here in Israel. And I'll start with saying a few things about the general political situation. In the end, when you count the fingers or the hands, it's easy to identify that in spite the fact that after 4 rounds of elections, we have a government. We have a government that for the last 6 months is functioning. I think that is functioning in a good manner, in a sophisticated ways, both internally and also in regard to the external challenges and opportunities. But in the end, we are talking on a very thin majority that supports this government. In the end, we have a very thin majority of 61 or 62 Knesset members out of 120. And in that regard, definitely, because of the structure of the Israeli political system, which is, as most of you know, extremely different than the American model, we need to say that the political situation in Israel is still highly complicated. And we have today in the Israeli parliament 13 different factions. 8 of them form the current coalition. And it's enough to remind the fact that the Prime Minister, Mr. Naftali Bennett, is coming from a party of only 6 mandates in order to understand that the situation is still fragile and as I said, sensitive and complicated. Yet I do want to recognize together with you 3 important elements in this government that create together what I tend to identify as a major opportunity. First of all, this is the most diverse Israeli government we ever had. Yes, it's true that its diversity also contributes to its complicated situation. Yet, when you keep in mind that Israel became more and more similar to Italy in the sense of not having the ability to form a government, this diversity brings with it also internal strength for this government and a real opportunity to address some of these major issues that the Israeli society is confronting with. I ask to remind you that this government and this coalition is spread from the deep religious right. The Prime Minister is coming from a modern Orthodox right-wing party, and it ends not with the Zionist left through the Labour Party and Meretz. It ends with, for the first time in the history of the State of Israel, a non-Zionist Arabic party. And this is the first time that an Arabic party is included in the Israeli coalition. In the days of the late Prime Minister Rabin, his government was supported by the Arabic parties in the opposition, but they didn't participate in the coalition. And in so many ways, this challenging topic of the relations between the Jewish majority and the Arab minority and the crucial governmental investments in the Arabic sector are part of the main agenda of this Israeli government, which again is not a central left-wing party. It's a unity party, extremely diverse. The second element has to do with the fact that this is a government with no ultra-Orthodox presence. None of the ultra-Orthodox parties is included or are included in this government. Now, it's important to say that as a member of the Labour Party, I don't think that we need to push back the ultra-Orthodox parties, or we need to hold a political ideology that there is no room for political cooperation with the ultra-Orthodox parties. And still, as we all know, some of the things we want to implement cannot be done in government with the ultra-Orthodox parties. And I'm not only referring to issues of religious pluralism. I would like to remind you all that today more than 20% of all the first graders in the Israeli schools come from the ultra-Orthodox sector. Unfortunately, today, there is no public school system for the Haredi community. They get 100% of the public funding, but they don't follow any of the guidelines of the public educational system. They don't teach core curriculum. And in that regard, this is a major threat for the future of the state of Israel as a developed nation. And this issue has nothing to do with the status of the non-Orthodox streams, and it's quite clear that we cannot address those issues when we have the ultra-Orthodox parties inside the government. The last thing I want to share with you in regard to the general character of this government is that, unfortunately, in the last few years, Israel was caught in a very rough, challenging, and harmful political discourse. And when I'm talking with dear American friends and colleagues, I'm sure you can identify with us or with me when I'm saying it. I think that the two societies in the last few years were challenged by the lack of ability to nurture and to strengthen a good civil discourse that enables our societies to have a sincere and a deep political battle or argument, but with at the same time to have the ability to maintain our collective structure as societies. And in Israel, this is the way the Israeli system works. The best reflection of this challenging phenomena was the fact that we went to the polls 4 times in 2 years. And I'm glad to say that meanwhile, in spite of the challenges, and no one is trying to suggest that Naftali Bennett's partner in his party, are waving in their hands when I'm taking a Torah scroll into the Western Wall and deliver it to the women of the wall. But still, there is nothing to compare between the previous political discourse in Israel to the current situation. Unfortunately, the opposition led by the Likud party is still trying to delegitimize the government, still trying to suggest that the current government doesn't have the authority to take the lead. But if you look closely into the volume of the Israeli political debate, to the political tension inside the Israeli society, we are definitely in a different place. Now, in the next few minutes, I want to say a few short things about the opportunities we have in the current government in the Knesset. I will just share one correction. I'm not a member of the government, not yet, and I'm not a minister. I'm a member of the Knesset, of the parliament, and I'm heading as I was presented, the Constitutional Committee. Give me a few years in the parliament and then I will be a member of the government. But I do want to say the followings about the opportunities we have, and I will be very short and will turn to the second part of question and answers. First, when we talk about the opportunities, we always need to think about the alternative reality. And here I want to say that if the last elections would have ended with a right-wing, ultra-Orthodox government, it is clear that some of our most important achievements in the Supreme Court in the last few years would have abolished by the new government. And the best example is the rulings of the Israeli Supreme Court in regard to the non-Orthodox conversions. I think that by having the current government, we are able to protect the already existing constitutional and political achievements that we achieved in the last few decades, mainly through petitions to the Israeli Supreme Court. Second, it is clear that the level of exposure to the non-Orthodox denominations jumped to the sky after I entered the Knesset. And in that regard, it's important to say, although I'm the only non-Orthodox rabbi in the Knesset, we have today other Knesset members that are key players in the non-Orthodox streams. One of my colleagues is one of the leading lay leaders of the Israeli conservative movement. We can at least identify 3-4 other Knesset members who are members, official members of Reform or conservative congregations here in Israel. A week from now, we are going to establish the Knesset Caucus for Religious Pluralism that will include those Knesset members. Following what I started with, one of our major achievements is that as part of the coming national budget, we are now working on the new national budget. For the first time in this history of Israel, there will be a line in the Israeli budget for governmental support to this important work of promoting religious pluralism, Jewish pluralistic renaissance, and the two movements, the Reform movement and the conservative movement. It's a small step forward, but a very meaningful one. We are establishing the Labour Party, following my suggestion and actually demand, took upon itself the Ministry for Diaspora Affairs. It was always led by Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox ministers. It's the first time that a minister from the more liberal side of the Israeli Knesset is leading this ministry. It's my friend and colleague, Dr. Nachman Shai. And part of the coalition agreement is to establish a new governmental wing, which will be titled with Agaf Chadeshet, the Department for Jewish Renewal. And there is a different meaning in Hebrew and English to this term. We mean the non-Orthodox streams. Now, and I'm sure that Ted will raise specific questions about the Kotel, so I will not get into details. I will only say that aside of getting this financial support, which is critical to set the facts on ground, we strongly believe that there are opportunities to move forward in many, many different arenas. And here I will end my remarks and end it to Ted that will ask the questions.
Gilad, if I can call you Gilad.
Of course.
Member of Knesset, Kariv. It's great to see you, and it's great to see you healthy, and it's great to see you back to work. My plan is to ask questions in 5 categories: government, Palestinians, travel, diaspora, and IMPJ. Some of the questions you've already begun to answer, but maybe we can enhance some of the answers. But the first question I have, and it's really crazy. I was in synagogue this week and I listened about Noah, and I thought about great leaders in history of Judaism. And I said, we Jews have had many leaders since the days of Moses. What historic leader do you admire and perhaps see as a mentor?
Well, that's an interesting question. I'm a great admirer of David Ben-Gurion. I truly believe that he had this ability to identify when is the right moment to insist on your values and your original plans, and when to compromise. And this ability to use those two tools enabled him at the same way to be a great politician, but more important, a great statesman or state person. And I'm reading all the biographies I can find, both in Hebrew and in English, of this visionary found father of the state of Israel. And he's definitely one of my leading choices for great Jewish leaders.
So David Ben-Gurion, it's funny that you mentioned Ben-Gurion, because my father was an admirer of Ben-Gurion. And my father used to say, because Ben-Gurion's family was in the Reform movement, that if David Ben-Gurion were alive today and saw what was going on, what would he have done different? Maybe I could ask you that question, is what should David Ben-Gurion have done different for our movement?
So first I need to share with you, if you share the personal story, I'll share with you that I was born a day after David Ben-Gurion died in 1973. And one of my two grandfathers, was a political ally and a disciple of Ben-Gurion. He was called by Ben-Gurion from the Jewish brigade in the British Army to be a member of the founding group of the IDF in 1948. And he came to my mother and asked her to name me David after his beloved leader. The challenge was that my other grandfather came from the Irgunim, the other side of the political map. And he said, no way my little grandson will be named after this corrupted and vicious leader. And that's the way I was saved from being called David, and my mother gave me the name Gilad. But since then, I have special emotions towards the memory of Ben-Gurion. Now, you asked me what would have Ben-Gurion have done differently. So I don't need to assume, because towards the end of his days, the late 60s and the beginning of the 70s, those were the years that our movement started to plant its roots in Israel. The first Israeli Reform congregation was established in Jerusalem in 1958. In 1963, the Hebrew Union College established its institutions in Jerusalem, not our magnificent current campus, but the first programs were opened in 1963. At least 10 more Reform communities were established in Israel during the 60s. Rabbi Bob Samuels, the late rabbis Bob Samuels and Moshe Zemer arrived during the 60s to Israel. Ben-Gurion met the both of them. The INPJ was founded in 1965. So Ben-Gurion had the opportunity to see the first seeds of Reform Judaism in Israel, and also to see the first reactions of the ultra-Orthodox parties towards those pioneers. The controversy around the wall didn't start with the women of the wall 30 years ago. Don't know if you know this piece of history, but the mechitza, the separating wall in the Kotel, was set because the CCAR, the rabbinical conference of our movement in North America, after 1967, had its first convention in Israel ever, and they wanted to have a service near the wall in 1968, and because the ultra-Orthodox parties wanted to prevent them from having the service, they placed the mechitza, right? And Ben-Gurion shared his views with the Israeli audience about those things. And he said in a very clear way, although he was, he established Israel on the basis of an alliance between the Labour Party and the ultra-Orthodox parties. They were part of his first government. He said, I did a mistake in that regard. And he said, we need to make sure that all streams of Judaism have place in Israel. He bashed one of the ultra-Orthodox prominent Knesset members in the end of the 60s that violated Reform Sidur. He met our rabbis, he met the leaders of our movement, and he said to the leadership of our movement, a few years before the late Rabbi Dick Hirsch moved the offices of the World Union from New York to Jerusalem, he said we need Reform Judaism to see the state of Israel as its growing center. So it's quite clear what he would have said if he were with us today.
Okay, I think I'm going to come back to some more IMPJ later, but I think I'm going to ask you government questions. And as the first Reform rabbi, you've answered some of this, but I want, maybe you can talk a little to this question. As the first Reform rabbi in Knesset, how would you characterize your election to office? Is this a breakthrough for the Reform movement or just a footnote?
Well, first of all, I want to say that we need to see. Give me a few years and we'll see. Okay, but I really want to say,
okay,
there is an opportunity, if we work together wisely, that me being here in the Knesset can become a game changer. There is a possibility. It forces us to think together in a strategic manner. It forces us to identify together, I'm saying the Israeli movement, the North American movement, me personally, my party, the Labour Party, but it forces us to have strategic plans. It's not enough to have a Reform rabbi in the Knesset. We need to work hard in order to get something out of it. And there is an opportunity that it will become a game changer at the same time. And it goes back to what I said at the beginning of our discussion. If anyone expects this fact to change by itself dramatically our reality in Israel, I think this is a political naivety. It is clear that it is not enough. If we don't work wisely, it might be a footnote. I don't allow myself to celebrate too much the fact that I was elected. And we'll have to see in a year or two if we can translate it into concrete achievements.
How do you build the relationships though with those who speak against our movement, against you, and even boycott you?
So here I think that we need to have a very clear distinction between the ultra-Orthodox Knesset members and the ultra-Orthodox parties and the modern Orthodox parties, and we have two. One is a leading party in the coalition, the party of the Prime Minister, and the other is an extremely right-wing opposition party, but they identify as modern Orthodox and not as ultra-Orthodox. With the ultra-Orthodox parties, definitely on the formal level, in the formal level, there is no dialogue. They boycott me when I speak. They leave the plenary. They do not enter, or most of them do not participate in the Knesset committee I'm leading. This is a very rough and challenging political debate and discourse, and I'm being presented in a very unfair way in the ultra-Orthodox media. In the end, always, they see that, beyond the curtains, there is a dialogue with some of them. They do see that they are not the only ones that know what is this week parasha. They are not the only Knesset members that can quote the Talmud. But those are rough relations. With the modern Orthodox parties, this is a different world. Here I really see a major impact of me being here in the Knesset. The fact that I sit next to the chair of the modern Orthodox party. I have the Israeli Reform Sidur on my seat in the plenary. And I'm sitting next to a modern Orthodox prominent Knesset member. And he looks in the Siddur. You know, it's in the end, it's about the dialogue between two people. It's about finding way to balance the values and the needs of those two sides. Here, I do think that there is a real opportunity for a major breakthrough in the attitudes of the modern Orthodox community towards our movement. And it's not only because I'm here. A few months ago, one of the most prominent modern Orthodox rabbis in Israel initiated a meeting with our leading rabbi in France, Rabbi Delphine Olivier, here in a conference in Jerusalem, calling for revisioning the attitude of the Orthodox community in Israel towards the streams. So I definitely think that me being here came in the right moment to create a new discourse with the modern Orthodox community in Israel.
Okay, I think I'm gonna ask one more on the government right now. If we have time to come back, I'll come back. And you mentioned the Kotel, so I guess I have to have one question about the Kotel. The struggle for an egalitarian section at the Western Wall, the Kotel, where progressive Jews can pray with dignity, is an ongoing and complex story. How much progress is being made to implement the Kotel agreement, and do you think that this will happen quickly?
So till now, the only good news, which I think are important, is that the government is committed to implement the agreement in the Kotel. We heard it from the Prime Minister itself. We heard it from many, many leaders of the other coalition partners. And we heard it even from the Ministry of Religious Affairs, who is a member of the Prime Minister's party. There is a deep understanding that part of the new winds of change that this government must bring, the issue of the Kotel is one of those public issues. I can share with you that in the last visit of the Prime Minister in New York, in order to participate in the UN General Assembly, the right messages were delivered to the leadership of the URJ and the Reform community in North America. The same messages are being presented to me. In November 14th, this coming November 14th, we need to approve the national budget. It secures the stability of the government till the end of 2022. And my assumption is that immediately after, the government will initiate the dialogue, the formal dialogue with the streams, with the Jewish Agency, on how to implement the Kotel agreement. It doesn't mean that we will not be called to consider some changes, some modifications. It's okay, a few years have passed since the original agreement was signed, but basically this government is committed to do it, and I'm planning to use my political power together with my friends to make sure that this government is moving in that direction.
I remember several years ago meeting with the Prime Minister with you on the Kotel agreement, and I look forward to the success. Before I leave the government, I'm looking at the chat and I see that our good friend Ron Cohen has a question, and I'm going to ask it because I would never not ask Ron Cohen's question. Where do you see your future in the Knesset and the Israeli government, and what do you want to accomplish?
Look, first, it's not a secret that I pushed the Labour Party to demand the Ministry of Diaspora Affairs, and I wanted to serve in this capacity. For internal partisan policies, I was not able to get this position now. And I'm glad that my good friend Nachman Shai, who is fully committed to religious pluralism, is leading this ministry. Today I need to say that I'm celebrating the fact that I became to be the chair of the Constitutional Committee of the Knesset. Many of the religion and state and the most burning constitutional issues are brought to our committee, and I'm deeply, deeply satisfied with my current position. I'm heading three different caucuses in the Knesset: the Caucus for Religious Pluralism and Freedom of Religion, the Caucus for the Israeli youth movements and youth organizations, and the Caucus for Veteran Citizens. And I think that those three groups of MK present the values that we carry as progressive Jews, our social values, our desire to secure the role of public education, both formal and non-formal, our deep belief in the power of community, of Kehillah, and of course our commitment for religious pluralism. Looking into the future, again, if I'm re-elected to the next Knesset, I definitely want to be a member of the government. And when you ask me what I want to achieve, it's very easy to answer this question. I want to implement the values of our movement here in Israel, definitely in the arena of religion and state, and bringing or creating a much more pluralistic and inclusive Jewish and democratic environment in Israel. But it doesn't end with religious pluralism. We are a movement which is deeply committed to social justice. We are a movement which is deeply committed to the concept of building an inclusive society. Israel is the only country in which the Jews are the majority. And this is the place that we need to show that we know how to treat the minorities in the way we ask, in the way we wanted for generations other to treat us. So the issue of Jewish and Arab relations here in Israel are a key part of my political agenda. And in that regard, this is the agenda. This is the agenda. And in the end, when you serve such a complicated coalition, you can't have a list of 10 goals and that's it. You need to see how out of 50 objectives, in the end, through different political situations, you can achieve 10 or 15. And I think that you can list those 50 objectives by yourself. We share the same values and dreams.
Okay, I'm going to move on to Palestinians. Representatives of Meretz Party, including Health Minister Nitzan Horowitz, recently visited Palestinian Premier Mahmoud Abbas. Will you and your Labor Party visit Abbas, and how did you react to the visit?
Look, one of the things that we all need to remember, Israelis and Jews overseas, is that in the end, Israel has daily relations with the Palestinian Authority. The quiet years that we experience in the West Bank in compared to the situation in Gaza, and again, it's not that there is no violence, and unfortunately there are victims and there are challenging days, and only a few months ago we all know what happened in Jerusalem and in other cities. I'm not suggesting that we enter the promised land, but in the end, there is nothing to compare between the situation in the West Bank and in Gaza, not only in regard to its impact, their impact on Israel, also in regard to the well-being of the Palestinians. And a major part of the more quiet reality in the West Bank has to do with the ongoing daily relations between the IDF and the security units of the Palestinian Authority, the dialogue between the different Israeli governmental ministries and the ministries of the Palestinian Authority. It's not a secret. And if this is the case, there is no good reason why Israeli leading politicians should refrain from meeting their Palestinian colleagues. I understand why, for internal Israeli political reasons, Naftali Bennett, the prime minister, cannot allow himself to meet Mahmoud Abbas. He's coming from the right. But I'm celebrating the fact that other ministers, including the security minister, the defense minister, Benny Gantz, met with Mahmoud Abbas, and a few days ago, as you stated, Ted, also the Meretz ministers. We in the Labour Party, we thought that in the coming 3-4 weeks, we need to invest our entire energy in pushing forward the national budget and not dealing with other issues. But I see no reason why not to meet but I will say differently. There is a good reason why we must meet our Palestinian partners.
Okay.
Generally speaking, about the situation with the Palestinians, I'm willing to accept the political analysis that it is extremely difficult and maybe not possible to reach an agreement in the near future. But we have a serious duty to make sure that the reality on ground will not prevent the two-state solution once we have a good partner to negotiate with and to create a deal. And this is something that we must remember. In the end, the ability to implement a two-state solution depends on the reality on the ground. The expansion of the settlements, the economic situation in the West Bank, and in that regard, even if we don't identify a partner right now, let's make sure that if a new partner emerges in the Palestinian side, the reality on ground will enable us to move slowly and smartly towards a solution. And right now, I identify this understanding as the deep difference between the Israeli right and the Israeli Zionist left. We are not suggesting that the solution is around the corner. We are not suggesting Mahmoud Abbas has the ability to sign an agreement. We are only suggesting that we are reaching a critical moment, and if we'll not be careful, the opportunity for a two-state solution will disappear forever, demographically speaking. And that is why we need to be very careful and strategic in the way we construct the reality in the West Bank.
Okay, I think we understand where you are in that area. I'm going to move on. I want to ask this question. Representative Ted Deutsch accused House Democrat Rashida Tlaib of besmirching an ally and engaging in anti-Semitic remarks after she delivered a condemnation of Israel during a funding debate over Israel's Iron Dome defense system. Tlaib also referred to Israel as an apartheid state. How do you answer the charges of apartheid leveled at Israel?
Look, first of all, I want to be careful. I think that the duty to criticize American politicians is in the hands of the American voters. And I think that definitely the North American Jewish community needs to build smart strategies to deal with this bipartisan threat of extreme forces on the two sides of the political sequence that are using an anti-Israel rhetoric in order to promote anti-Semitic views or attitudes that cannot be accepted at the beginning of the 21st century. As an Israeli that opposes the military occupation of the West Bank, as a person that fully supports the two-state solution and the ongoing dialogue with the Palestinians, I'm saying out loudly Israel is not an apartheid state. Israel is not close to the legal and to the political reality of South Africa during the, till the end of the 80s. People that suggest it don't understand the reality in Israel and the West Bank and don't understand what was the situation in South Africa. I don't need the apartheid example in order to understand that we must implement the two-state solution in order to keep Israel both Jewish and democratic. Now, it's not a surprise that the American left includes also extreme views or a portion of the American left holds views against Israel. This is not a new reality. If you go back to the 60s and 50s, and even after it, you see that this is a known, this was an existing phenomena in parts of the Democratic Party. Those scaring phenomena belong also to the other side, extreme side of the political map. What we need to do is to cultivate the majority of American politicians from both parties that identify the American need and the Israeli need for a very strong alliance. Unfortunately, the previous government in Israel neglected the need to strengthen the status of Israel inside the Democratic Party. They refused to carry Prime Minister Netanyahu, the previous Prime Minister, and his party refused to hold the bipartisan policy. This is this was the reality. For good reasons, for bad reasons, this was the reality.
Gilad, we're
and
running
now
out of
the new government, and I'll just say, the new government, which is again, this is not a left-wing party. It's a unity government that includes right-wing parties. We have the opportunity to reestablish and re-strengthen the bipartisan policy, and this is the best way to deal with those extreme voices.
I have just a few more questions and we're running out of time. I have a category called travel that I had 3 questions, but I'm going to try to pull them all into one real easy. The travel part is, you know, apparently the tourism industry in Israel must be really hurting pretty bad. When do you think it's okay for people to travel to Israel? One of my questions was, if I got a bar mitzvah next June, should I change my plans or should I come? And then the last part of it really is how is Israel coping with the COVID? And, you know, what are you doing to get things better? Or where do you think things are going that way?
So look, first of all, as a veteran of the COVID-19 pandemic, I think we all understand that it's very difficult for us today to say something smart and knowledgeable about the reality a year from now. Unfortunately, we are now caught in a challenging situation that it's very difficult to make plans, both domestic and definitely in a global manner. Still, I do want to suggest that once Israel and the US are on the same ground when it comes to the vaccination plan, the sky will be open again. Meaning that right now, the only reason why American tourists cannot come to Israel is the fact that we started a massive campaign to give Israelis the 3rd vaccination, the booster shot. And this is not the situation with the vast majority of Americans. We assume that, good for you. I don't need it because I got the disease, but we assume that in few months from now, you know, in the next month or 2, most Western countries will identify what Israel already identified because we started very early with the vaccination plan, with the massive vaccination plan, and most Western countries will adopt the booster policy. Once this is done, the sky is open again.
So what you're
So
saying,
I
the
encourage
June
you-
bar mitzvah is safe.
I encourage you to make plans. I encourage you also to buy the right insurance policies if unfortunately you cannot implement your plans. But I really believe that in few weeks or a month or two, we'll be able to see each other not only through screens. Now, in regard to your second question with the COVID, how to say, don't quote me. On the one hand, Israel is an high-tech empire. At the same time, most of you know how Israelis behave. And in this strange meeting between the Israeli scientific lead, and the fact that Israelis like to do everything in their own way, unfortunately, we were caught in a fourth wave of the disease. Unfortunately, there are few Israeli communities that are not well vaccinated. There is a gap in the vaccination plan that it's very hard for cultural reasons to close. This is a very small country. So in the end, if in one city in the north, something is happening, in 2 weeks, it will be all around the country. Try to tell Israelis not to fly to Turkey or to Greece to have a good vacation during the summer. Tens of thousands of Israeli families rushed into vacations overseas. So this is the challenge we have. We are the leading country in the world in the use of the booster. I think we are very close to an Israeli vaccination, an Israeli version, a local production of vaccinations. I think that we have a very good public health system that is helping us to deal with this pandemic. And in the same time, we need to keep educating the Israeli public how to behave during a pandemic.
This has been really great talking with you today, Gilad. Let me ask one or two last questions, and then we'll wrap this up today. How can we as diaspora Jews best support Israel? And I had a second question in there that's kind of contradictory to that. It says, why should diaspora Reform and conservative Jews give financially to Israel when in fact Israel does not respect our movement?
So first of all, I'll address the second question first.
Okay.
I'll start by saying that the only way, and I'm going back, it's very good that those are the concluding questions because it brings me back to my opening statement. The only way to bring the state of Israel to respect Reform Judaism is to make sure that Reform Judaism is well rooted in Israel. It's the only way. Unless Reform and conservative Judaism are becoming relevant to the Israeli public, and I'm telling you that there are many Israelis out there that are waiting for us, the policies of the state of Israel will not change. It's the old Zionist fashion of setting facts on ground, on changing the reality in order to gain the right results and policies. Now, why to do it? Because we have almost 7 million Jews in America. We have today 8 million Jews in Israel, 6 million Jews in America, but those two communities are the main two centers of Jewish life in the 21st century. And unless Reform Judaism, again, is stepping on two legs, one leg is the North American, and the other one is Israeli, we will not be able to continue to lead the Jewish people as we did during the 20th century. What can be done? First of all, yes, financial aid. I celebrated with you the fact that probably 2022 will be the first year that the Israeli government is investing serious money in building the Israeli non-Orthodox streams. But still, it's a very small step forward when you compare it to the support for the Orthodox establishment. We still need Jewish philanthropy from around the world. And please remember, maybe in 2 years, there will be a different government. Second, we need your political support. We need you to address the embassy, the consulates around the country, the Israeli organizations. Whenever an Israeli MK or mayor is coming to visit you, they need to hear your expectations in regard to the reality in Israel. A week from now, a group of leaders of regional councils from Israel will come and visit the US. They will be led by our people in the World Zionist Organization. We need you to be active in Arza. We need you to make sure that in the next Zionist elections, we have 150,000 Reform Jews that are voting for the Reform Zionist slate. We need you to push your congregations to build direct relations with 1 or 2 Israeli congregations, to study together, to share experiences. This 18 months of the pandemic taught us that we can do a lot through screens. We don't like it, but this was also a good opportunity to learn what we can achieve through the screens. So I think that there are many, many things we can do in order to strengthen the relations. And as Ted said, once the sky is open, renew your visits, your congregational and private visits to Israel. If you come, I can offer you a free tour in the Knesset.
Gilad, thank you so much. I want to add one comment, and that has to do with the contacting your consulates. You may go say hello to our good friend Lior Hayat, who used to be in Miami, but Lior, we used to send quite a few messages, and in fact, it does get to the Knesset. And I also want to put in a word for Arza as a member of the Herzl Society. We all got to find ways to help our reform movement in Israel. Thank you very much, Gilad.
Thank you, friends. I appreciate the time and the invitation. Thank you.
The other piece is there was a lot of questions in the chat that we didn't get to, and it's really hard to find the right questions for an hour, but hopefully we covered them. I
want to echo that. Thank you, Rabbi Kariv. Thank you, Tad. I do have to take exception with one thing that you said, and I think these screens have proved valuable. I've gotten innumerable comments. This is wonderful. Can we extend the time? To which I'm going to say, hopefully you'll accept an invitation to repeat this in a few months, and we can definitely touch on more then. At the beginning, I made introductions of Tad and Jeff, and I am now going to turn it over to Jeff to conclude our webinar.
Great, thank you, Stephen. And as both Stephen and Tad said, we had lots of questions. We could have gone on for hours, but there will hopefully be other opportunities, both with MRJ and within the reform movement, to engage with you again, Rabbi Kariv. You know, we went on a little bit longer, and that's great. You know, we had great questions, and it was a very engaging and lively conversation. So sorry if we didn't get to every question, but we will continue the conversation. So I'd just like to acknowledge that this program was sponsored by the Men of Reform Judaism, MRJ, and also MRJ of South Florida. So I'd like to first off thank Rabbi Kariv for being here into the evening, his time, after a full day of working and taking the time to be with us. It was wonderful, and we invite you back for more discussions. I'd also like to acknowledge Rob Himmelstein, who's the president of the MRJ. He couldn't be here, unfortunately, today. This was recorded, so there will be links to the recording, or it will be posted on the MRJ website shortly. I'd also like to thank Tad Schwab, my friend in Florida here. We're both from Florida. He was instrumental really in having this idea and then getting Rabbi Kariv here. And we'll have other programs along these lines. So I'd like to thank Tad, who's a great supporter of Israel and has wonderful ideas for additional programming that we're going to do. And finally, I'd like to thank Stephen Portnoy, who's past president of the MRJ and current executive director of the MRJ, and helped put a lot of this together and send out the email reminders and set up the Zoom. And finally, I'd like to thank really all of you who are out there in the audience for taking your time out of your Sunday to be with us, some in the morning, some in the middle of the day, some in the evening, but to be with us today for a very lively and engaging and interesting conversation. So I don't think I'm forgetting anything, Stephen. So if I'm not, then, and I don't see him saying that I am, so we will say thank you for joining us today. Thank you for being here. We enjoy putting these on and being with all of you for a wonderful program. Have a great day, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thanks, Gilad. We'll see you another time.
Thank you.
I look forward to seeing you in Israel.